Okay, so we're looking at the preparation for your next assessment on principles of training. So the first questions on the assessment will ask you to define a term. To define a term, you're looking basically at the definition. So the definition is exact copy that's taken from your textbook and your copybook notes. Another question may ask you to explain the term. If you need to explain the term, you need to write down both the definition, but you can explain this in your own words. When you do this, it's best to then add in a simple, straightforward example that will help you get across what you mean. So for example, the question may ask you to explain the term specificity and how you apply it to a training program. So what we're looking at there is explain the term and its specificity. So you're thinking about all that you know about the definition of specificity and you're going to apply it to a training program. So the answer you're looking at here is specificity is explained as matching the training methods and principles to the specific requirements of the sport, and this is for the individual to get fitter. For example, a netball player requires developed components of muscular power and anaerobic endurance, as they need to sprint for the ball in a match and then use explosive movements like jumping to intercept passes. If you need to explain a bit further, or if the question requires you to have a few more extra lines of detail for more marks, you would then go on to explain, therefore you need specifically to plan running or short sprinting sessions to develop this anaerobic endurance. So why we've picked running is because in netball you need to have a lot of running. Not just aerobic endurance running where you're running for a long distance of time, but short bursts of speed like you would need in anaerobic endurance. The best training method for this would be interval training, or you could put fartlek training if needed. You also then would build in muscular power movements such as vertical jumps, squats, lunges, similar to what you'd be doing when you elevate to intercept a pass in netball. You would then finish the answer saying this will match the demands of the activity with the training program. Another question on your assessment paper will probably ask you to refer back to a resource or to a table or paragraph. If this happens, it is best that you need to read the question. I would read the question before you actually attempt to look through the resource or the table, because then you're getting a better understanding of what you're looking for. So I'd actually read it a number of times, and then you would highlight those keywords so that you can scan very quickly whenever you're under a time constraint to know what specifically you're looking at. So, for example, this is your question. Shane wants to plan a program to improve his health-related fitness. He wants to vary the activities that he does and progressively overload the training he does over 4 different phases, or these mean groups of weeks. So I would advise you to read the question again, highlight your keywords, and then we'll start to plan as we look at your table. So again, Shane wants to plan a program to improve health-related fitness. This is really important. You need to look at health-related fitness because this is where we're looking at the specific components of fitness. This is health, not peak. You're not peaking in this area, you're health-related fitness. It also goes on to say he wants to vary the activities. We know vary means variety, and this is a principle of training. So he wants to vary the activities, and that means for health, you're talking about varying different activities for those components of fitness. And then he wants to progressively overload. Well, we all know what progressively overload means there, and specifically we're looking at the frequency, intensity, time type. Now this section here about the 4 different phases, that could throw you to start off with, but you'll see quite easily how this fits into the table when we look over Leaf. So as we look at the table, we can see that this is very daunting to start off with. But if you look back at the question again, we know again it's health related. So if we look at health related fitness, we know that there's 3 components of fitness that are in health related fitness. So the 3 components are aerobic, the other component is muscular endurance, and the last component is flexibility. Okay? As we're looking at these 3 components of fitness, we need to make sure we are looking specifically at whatever the question then goes on to ask us. In this question and in the question in your assessment, it will ask you only about the aerobic component. Not many questions will ask you to talk about all 3. So we're looking specifically in this question on the aerobic component. Now, the aerobic component involves things like running, cycling, swimming, etc. So for variety, we're talking about varying the activity that you do. So first of all, we can talk about running. We could also talk about cycling. We could also talk about swimming. There's a few ideas to get your mind thinking what you could do. The last phase here is also looking at progressively overloading. Well, we know that we need to progressively overload using the FIT principle. So the FIT principle is frequency, intensity, time, and type. Now, we look back again at this question. It asked you to look at health-related fitness. In health-related fitness, and especially in the aerobic area of health-related fitness, the big thing that you need to home in on and what you'll be mostly progressively overloading is always going to be time. It's very rarely that you need to increase intensity. And the reason you don't need to increase intensity is that you're not trying to peak. You're not trying to win a race. You're not trying to play it harder or fatigue less easily. You're trying to increase your fitness as regards how far or how long you can run for, walk for, cycle for. So the first thing we'll be looking to do is increase frequency and then time. Okay, so this is a resource we have been given. So let's look at this very carefully. The 2 types of activity that are given in the current activity level are given to you as a foundation. Okay, so the foundation we're given is continuous steady pace walk. The other one is a continuous steady pace walk, but the 2 differ slightly. One has 60% max heart rate at 30 minutes. The other has 70% max heart rate for 20 minutes. So the first thing we want to look at is bringing those down into the first phase. So this is our first phase of our overload or progressive overload, as discussed in the last question. So, continuous steady pace. We do not overload the type of activity. We should keep this activity as a walk because this is what the person has adapted to. So we'll keep this as a walk. However, when we know about the minimum threshold for overload, and if you can remember that from the very first day in class, we talked about the threshold or the minimum amount of training you need to do to get fitter is obviously 3 sessions a week. So we need to make sure first we add another session, but also we're looking at the intensity of this walk. Walking at 60% of max heart rate is not going to get you up until that minimum threshold. So instead of increasing the time in this, we need to bring up the intensity to 70%. And that is because that is the rules for minimum overload. So 70% max heart rate. And because we increase the intensity, we should leave the time at this. So we need to leave the time at 30 minutes. Let's look at the far side over here. Again, we keep the walk here. We keep the time at this 70% because that is ideal for health rate of fitness. We keep the 70%, but what we should do here is also increase our time as discussed earlier. So increase our time to 30 minutes. So as we've done this for these 2 sessions that the person has already been adapted to, we need to then look and see where are we going to put our next session. So let's talk about putting our next session. Let's choose here. We're choosing here because as we come along here, this is the hard session. So we're going to choose halfway along here to make sure that they have enough break before they come to this. So we'll keep it as a continuous steady pace training. The person has adapted to continuous steady pace and they are going to adapt to keeping it at that 70% max heart rate. We have to then look at this variety. So we want to look at variety at this section. So I'm just choosing to put in a swim. You could put in a cycle, you could put in a skip, you could put something different in there, but I'm going to choose for a swim. After we look at swim, we're again looking at what the minimum time was for overload, and the minimum time this person could do was 20 minutes. So we're going to keep this at 20 minutes, and because it is a continuous steady pace, we're keeping our intensity at 70% max heart rate. Okay, so if we look again, the first phase, we're increasing the intensity but keeping the time. We're increasing the time, obviously maintain this intensity. We're keeping this intensity the same, but going to what the minimum time was they could do, as this whole session is an overload. So this is the first phase of training. The second phase, after they've done these 3 weeks, they should be very adapted to this type of training. So we're looking again at overloading this session. We should overload this session by keeping this at 70% max heart rate, but we should look at increasing the time. So let's increase the time again to 40 minutes. Over the far side, again, this session here, we could increase this session again, but before we come along, let's look at this session here. This is the next session in line with this first session here, which is the hardest session of the week. So if this is continuous steady pace swim at 70% max heart rate, we need to increase it up to 30 minutes. So again, keep this at 30 minutes. If we are having a continuous steady pace walk on the far side, we can keep this at 70% max heart rate, but before we put the time down here, there's one thing we're missing, and that is, of course, adding in frequency. So let's add in the other frequency to this section here. So we'll keep that as a continuous steady pace, and I'm going to choose cycle because that is our variety. I'm keeping that at 70%. And can you remember what the minimum overload we can be doing? That's correct, 20 minutes. So we'll keep this at 20 minutes. And then we should keep this, therefore, at our 30 minutes. The reason we keep this at 30 minutes is if you look now, you're now doing 40 sessions a week, or 4 sessions a week, but these 2 sessions are now back to back. So this session now becomes a sort of recovery session. So to increase this session one more time, and time-wise, you're actually overloading too much. Again, we move on to the third phase, continuous steady pace walk. Again, 70% max heart rate. And again, we overload on the time, so 50 minutes. Again, moved on to the next session, continuous steady pace swim. We make sure not to change these types of activities from these sessions. So keep your times or your activities and types of training the same when you move from one phase of training to the next. So continuous steady pace training, 70% max heart rate. Let's look again. Do we overload in this session again? So we're going to keep that out for a second, and we're going to look at how we're going to overload this section here. So again, we're looking at continuous steady pace. We're looking again at a cycle, 70%, we bring it up to the minimum, which is 30 minutes. Again, continuous steady pace walk, 70%. We're going to maintain this at 30 minutes. Now, we have not put in a time here, and I've put in a time here to bring this up to 30 minutes. We've kept this as a recovery session. We've overloaded this session here. We have not increased in frequency. So I'm going to choose to increase the frequency in this session here, and I'm going to bring that on to a run, just to show different variety again. So a run, 70% max heart rate. What's the minimum I can do for a run? Let's look back again. 20 minutes was the minimum time we could do. So 20 minutes for here. Let's look back here, and we're going to keep this at 30 minutes. Now, this could be very confusing, but if you look through your overload session here, you take a rest recovery day, you work hard again day 2 of your session of your week, rest recovery on this day, but you're doing a run at a lower intensity or lower time, increase in time again, full day recovery, back to another session again before you come back to this day. So remember, you're doing this for 3 weeks. So once you come to this section here, you should be able to keep this maintained and adapted to the next session. Moving down to the last phase of the weeks. Again, we keep on continuous steady pace walk. We do this at 70%. And what time should we go from? 60. Remember, a 60-minute walk is very easy at this stage to overload, because again, you're now running for 20 minutes in your section. You're now cycling for 30 minutes in your session. So remember, a cycle is a much more intense exercise than a walk would be. Moving on to the next section, continuous steady pace swim. I'm going to keep that at 70%. We move on to this section, continuous steady paced run. Keep that at 70%. We'll keep this continuous steady pace cycle. Keep it at 70%. Continuous steady pace walk. And keep this at 70%. Again, we keep this at 30 minutes. Now, these 3 sections here, remember we have to add on one more frequency. So I'm going to choose to put the frequency on here. And because we've used our plan of our walk, cycle, or swim from before, I want you to think of another activity. I'm just choosing dance. Dance is an aerobic activity. We could use that. We could use skipping. We could choose step-ups. We could use anything like that. I'm just using dance for this activity. So 70% max heart rate. What's the minimum we can do our dance for again? Look back, 20 minutes. So 20 minutes. So when we look at these 3 sections here, what is the one that we're going to overload on? Well, it actually is moving this one here on to 30 minutes to bring it to the minimum section. This section here and next section here, we can keep this one the same at 30, or we can move it on to 40. And moving this section on to 40 again. It would not be an overload or progressive overload if we kept all 3 as a 30 minutes. The reason because we have one rest day and we need to work harder than what we did obviously in a rest day, which is rest recovery day. This is our next rest recovery day when we have exercise, and so is this section here. So we can see that there are 3 hard sessions and there are 3 hard sessions and 3 sort of recovery sessions in this week. Now, again, when we're looking at the whole plan together, we can see that we have kept Tuesday as a full recovery day. We also have changed our activities as we've gone down by simply thinking about that aerobic activities can be done. You will never be marked incorrect for using the correct activities such as cycle, run, swim. To add in another session, remember you're always talking about this intensity and this minimum overload because that is reaching your threshold. So that is how you would attempt to start a question that has a large resource sheet like this. You're making sure that you go down through it and even making a note at the bottom of where you put in a variety and why you did this.